Welcome, everyone. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for the first event of our fall speaker series, Rebuilding Trust in Democratic Institutions. Today's topic is journalistic integrity in a disinformation age. I am Lisa Lewis, the Administrative Manager at the Whitburn Center. Please note that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Whitburn Center's website and YouTube channel. Please keep your mics muted. We'll have time for the Q&A at the end. And let me give you a quick overview of who we are. We were founded in 2021 through a generous gift from UWO alum Jerry Whitburn. The center conducts nonpartisan, practical research to improve governance and public policy in Wisconsin and beyond. Our goal is to strengthen local government, nonprofits, and communities by bringing people together to share knowledge and provide tools to support the public sector. And now I will turn things over to Dr. Sam Larson, who will get us started.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, very much. Hi, everyone. For those who are new to us and this event, my name is Sam Larson, and I'm the interim director of the Whitburn Center and an associate professor here at UW-Oshkosh in our Master of Public Administration program. I also want to just take a moment to let you all know that the Whitburn Center is now leading the coordination, essentially, of the Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust, or WisACT, which was previously an independent initiative co-founded by today's moderator, David Haynes, back in 2023. And I want to really kind of highlight really the beginnings of WisACT, because I think our event today is really living into its values. So David was the co-founder and Democratic co-lead of WisACT, alongside Republican co-lead, former Republican Governor Scott McCallum. And so that history is really important, I think, because prior to that, David spent a number of years in Wisconsin media. He held a number of roles at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, including business editor, opinion editor, community engagement coordinator. And I want to highlight, in 2017, he founded the Ideas Lab, which people may be familiar with, which aimed to address both Milwaukee, but Wisconsin more broadly, the challenges being faced in our state through, commentary and something called solutions journalism, which I absolutely love. So I think that's so pertinent for our discussion today. And I just want to, again, start by giving a special thanks to David for coming back to us. So the management of WisACT transitioned to the Whitburn Center back in March of this year. And we've been trying our best to make that smooth. But we're very happy to have our co-founder back with us today. And I also want folks to know that WisACT is really a growing movement. We have over 450 members who essentially pledged to help us in promoting and restoring trust in our democratic institutions in a number of ways. One is encouraging civil discourse. Another is promoting accurate information and encouraging fact-checking of information about the political process to build trust in elections. But I think where we're seeing a need is in all kind of the cornerstones of our democracy and institutions like an independent media that we'll be talking about today, and taking action. So focusing specifically on the goal of countering intimidation and political and identity-based violence. And so today's event, I think, is really helping us continue to move that needle. Again, I'm really thankful to everyone who's joining us today to really, I think, at this time, help us continue to process and make sense of, honestly, the past several weeks, events of the past several weeks as they pertain to both political violence and free speech. And so with that, I will just say, grateful again, David, for you being with us, and to our amazing, incredible all-star panel. I think we couldn't have anyone better to be with us today. So I'll hand it to you, David, and just really looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Sam. It's great to be back with WisACT. WisACT, as Sam mentioned, was really focused on trying to reduce in whatever way we can the risk of political violence and intimidation, something that's certainly been in the news even just today with the shooting in Dallas. So it's my pleasure to be here. and to be with this great panel. Let me introduce our panel. I want to start with a former colleague of mine, Ron. You'll note I didn't say old colleague. Ron Smith, who is Executive Director of Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service. NNS covers neighborhoods throughout the city. Ron, welcome.
Thank you.
And Jessie Opoien, who's a political reporter working out of the Madison Bureau for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Jessie has covered the State House now for more than a decade. Jessie, welcome.
Thank you.
And also Frederica Freiberg, who's a news anchor with Wisconsin Public Television and host of the popular public affairs program Here and Now. Frederica, welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, Dan Kaufman, a Wisconsin native and a contributing writer for The New Yorker. He's author of the 2018 book, The Fall of Wisconsin, which looked at the evolution of Wisconsin from a progressive bastion to a toss-up state, and how the state has provided a model for conservative politics nationally. Dan, welcome.
Thank you. Just to quickly correct something, I'm a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine now. So, anyway,
good.
Yeah, slight change. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dan, let me start with you. I wonder if you can talk a bit about, in this era we live in now with hyper-partisan media, with influencers on social media, how do independent journalists like yourself and the others on the panel doing great journalism, how do you break through that noise?
It's a great question. I think my own view is I tend to focus on what I guess I might describe as more of a street level approach. So often my stories follow ordinary citizens as they encounter these larger political forces. So in that way, I'm able to get a lot more candor and sort of insight. It's a sort of, I guess you'd call it maybe a more angled approach. I have covered campaign races and so on, and that can be difficult to sift through the noise. My strategy has often been to try to find a different kind of approach to the story. For example, I wrote a piece last year for the Times Magazine about the enduring legacy of NAFTA, and it focused on the closure of the Masterlock plant in Milwaukee, and kind of it really centered the experiences of the workers there, but there was obviously a lot of pullback material around the debate and the battle over NAFTA, presidential politics, and so on. But I think that is one way that I don't know if I've been able to avoid it, but to kind of look at it a little bit more from the side, if you will, and to try to find an opening to get at what I think are important truths around sort of more foundational aspects of what's eroding what I believe, and I think a lot of people believe is eroding our democracy. So these might be labor battles or economic struggles, and but typically I try to find an angle that's a little different than just approaching it head on through a political prism of particularly partisan politics. So I guess that's something that is sort of, in a way, something I guess might be called my method to get around it, really, because it is quite intense, that the partisan lens which you described.
Yeah. Yeah. Jessie, I want to ask you a similar question, really the same question. You live in that Madison bubble, the State House, which is nothing but partisanship. How do you make decisions every day about what to cover? There are a million things you can cover. How do you make those decisions?
Yeah, it's really challenging. And speaking of the Madison bubble, I think that's probably the biggest challenge because there's for those who don't know, those of us who cover the Capitol regularly, there's actually a press room dedicated in the Capitol. It's between the Senate and the Assembly chambers. So, the Journal Sentinel, the Wisconsin State Journal, the Cap Times, AP, and then there's space for TV and radio to come through. So we've got people who are there all the time. Which is great because you know what's going on and you have access to lawmakers and staff, but also potentially a problem because you can get sucked into that bubble and start caring about the things that people in that bubble care about. If you're in Madison talking to political people, they just call it the building, and you know what they're talking about. It's the Capitol. Oh, did you see what was going on in the building today? So, you have to break out of that, and it's challenging. You're trying to follow legislation that's coming through. You're keeping an eye on campaign activity that may be happening, and how that activity in the Capitol may be influencing those campaigns. And then you're also trying to just figure out how this stuff is affecting regular people. And so I find it's good and healthy to get out every now and then, to even go to just even a campaign event, because you still meet regular people at campaign events. I went to Josh Schuman, one of the candidates for governor, recently was doing just a little meet and greet over in Jefferson County, Fort Atkinson he was in. And so I was just in a backyard with some people talking, obviously people interested in politics, but people who are talking about way different things than what I'm hearing people talking about in the Capitol, than what kind of bills I'm seeing coming through. Mostly primarily talking about the cost of housing at that point. So, which is something that really doesn't come up a lot in the Capitol. So it's helpful to do that. It's helpful to just, again, step back, take time to talk to people who are not immersed in it every day like you are, and realize that they're maybe paying attention to 2% of what is coming through our filters, and just hope that you're doing your best to catch what's actually going to impact people's lives, and then vice versa, convey that back to the lawmakers.
Frederica, let me turn to you. You've been an observer of Wisconsin politics and civic life for a number of years. What changes have you seen in recent years in terms of how the partisanship has sort of manifested itself in the state?
Well, I think we can all understand that there was a time when I first started here at PBS Wisconsin, and before that at WPR, that there were people across the aisle who did speak to each other, who did go out after a day at the Capitol and interact. Those being lawmakers or policymakers. I would say that. I think others would agree that 2010 was a year that really escalated the hyper partisanship in Wisconsin. And I'd say ever since then, it has just ratcheted up to this level that we're at now, which is like nothing I think any of us have seen. So those are clear kind of calendar markers of what I've seen in terms of the change.
And Ron, talk a little bit about at the hyperlocal level, which is where you live. What do you see there, and what steps does Neighborhood News Service take to ensure that it can build trust with the people consuming its product?
That's a really good question. For those who don't know, the Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service has been around for 14 years. We are a nonprofit newsroom that really centers Black and Brown communities in Milwaukee. And it was founded because other outlets were not really centering those neighborhoods unless there was gloom and doom, drama and trauma. So our mandate as a hyperlocal newsroom is to do three things. It's one, to celebrate the ordinary people who do extraordinary things. Second is education. And by that, connecting them with resources that they can use to navigate their lives. So if we're going to write a story about evictions in Milwaukee, we're also going to write about how not to get evicted. And the last part that we do is what we all do, is that illumination, that good watchdog reporting. Our editorial philosophy is really built on community listening. And so we have really built that into the fabric of our 10-person newsroom. And what happens is that we have a team of what we call community ambassadors. And there are 3 of them in addition to our newsroom. And their job is just to go out in the community and hear what's going on. Doesn't mean they have to go to a campaign rally. They might go to Puerto Rican Day Festival and just listen. And then they bring what they hear back to our newsroom. And an example of that was the last mayoral race. We were gearing up to interview all the candidates. And that was the first time NNS had done something like that. And Bevan Christie, who's our community engagement coordinator, said, you know, Ron, you actually need to explain what the mayor does. Our audience doesn't, I don't believe anyone knows what the mayor does. And we were all kind of like, really? And then we started talking amongst ourselves and like, we don't really have a clear idea of everything that the mayor does. So the managing editor at the time, Ricardo, wrote a piece that explained what the mayor did. That was the #1 story of the year. Of the year. And so now we think about our journalism as, of course, advocating for our readers, holding power to account, but also making sure that people understand the process. Because if they don't understand the process, they're not going to vote. They're going to stay in their bubble. It's hard to get people motivated to do anything if they don't understand the why. So we try to explain that why, and not in a condescending way, but hey, did you know? Here's what they do. Here's how to navigate that. Because we are finding that social studies has become a thing of the past, and people don't understand what that means. And by listening and centering the community and everything that we do, I feel like we have built trust that they know who we are, they know what we do. Because we're local, hyper local, I can get cursed out at the grocery store by the nun that we did for the nonprofit that she's running because we forgot a calendar listing. And then get a hug the next day. But we are held accountable by our readers. And so when the Republican National Convention was going on, CNN called and they said, hey, how do you build trust in your community? I said, we don't actually have to build trust. It's there because we have been there not only for 14 years, but in the community, listening to their concerns. So if they know NNS, they know what we do, who we are, and what we value. And the other part to me is that transparency. When we mess up, we fess up. We don't pretend to know everything. We own our mistakes. And I think that's really important in journalism because journalism for so long has been built on conflict, right? So if dog bites man, that's not a story. But if man bites dog, that's a story. And it's still a story, but we need to widen how we think about journalism so that it's not just based on conflict, because we are fueling some of that conflict without offering solutions to help people navigate their lives.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ron. Dan, I want to go back to you. Frederica mentioned 2010, and you've written a book that sort of recounts what happened in Wisconsin politics over that time. And one thing I was wondering about is, we talk a lot about now about disinformation as if it's a new phenomenon, but it's really not. But I do wonder, from your perspective, what feels different, if anything, about this moment?
In terms of 2010 or just in general?
Well, in general, but go back to 2010 as well.
2010, yeah. Well, I think, it's interesting. That was really, in many ways, I believe that the Act 10, which was a centerpiece of my book, the law that basically demolished collective bargaining rights for public employees, was a sort of an attack on Wisconsin's history. And there was a bipartisan tradition that promoted active citizenship, and that meant both parties supported very robust labor rights compared to many places in the country, supported public institutions, public schools, universities, and so on. So it was a really unprecedented attack that I think in many ways paved the way for Donald Trump. It was Scott Walker, then Governor Scott Walker, described it as he told his most important donor, Diane Hendricks, that he was going to use divide and conquer to split the labor movement, private sector and public sector unions against each other. And in fact, I think that's what he did. So I think that it was, there's so many things I guess I could say about disinformation and where we're at now. I think that 2010 was a watershed year across the country, and maybe most especially in Wisconsin, because of those attacks across the board on widely respected lowercase d democratic norms. And this continued in many forms over the Walker years. For example, I was just reviewing the lame duck session in 2018 when there was a stripping of powers from the governorship and the attorney general, which had been recently won by Democrats. And I think there was a kind of widespread, I think that period was very important because it was one, represented the nationalization, the total nationalization of Wisconsin's politics, but also I think it was the beginning of this idea, a real divorcing of any kind of consideration for the citizenry, which had been a facet more so in Wisconsin than in most places from politicians of both parties. This connection that goes back to the La Follette and the progressive era, which had been imparted on Wisconsin's political DNA, that there was a sort of modesty to many Wisconsin politicians, and definitely, even if they violated it at times and not everyone adhered to it, a respect for the fact that they were public servants. And I think that that was broken. I mean, you could see it in examples like Walker accepting a phone call from a person impersonating David Koch, that whereas he wasn't taking interview requests from local reporters. So there was that was sort of indicative, I think, of this extreme nationalization. I guess you could call it, extreme partisanship, but I view the Wisconsin tradition either as somewhat nonpartisan or at least bipartisan in that it was a real assault on these norms. And you're seeing, what happened in Wisconsin is nothing compared to the norms that are being dismantled today by the Trump administration. But it was really telling, I think, that it happened in Wisconsin. In fact, Walker boasted of it in his book. If we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. And I think that presaged or paved the way for a lot of what is happening now, even if it's, was whatever, 14 years ago. But it was a watershed moment. And for a lot of reasons, the attack on the labor movement, the attack on journalism. I feel like certain foundational pillars of democracy were really beginning to be undermined in that period, and a lot of things that hadn't been normalized were normalized and have been extended and pursued with much greater vigor and extremism in this current moment on a national scale. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those
Oh,
are
no,
just
it does.
thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Frederica, let me go back to you. The same question. Uh, does anything feel different now about this landscape we're in of dis and misinformation? And if so, what?
Well, I think so. There's so much of it, and there's so much kind of entrenchment in social media. We're kind of almost losing whole generations to social media and the effect that it might have on young people in particular. I do feel like it's different. One of the things that you were posing to us before this panel was um, what does this feel like right now? And I thought about it, and it feels frightening. And I think it feels frightening for citizens and audience and readers as well, because it seems kind of out of control, especially with this political violence that we're seeing. So as journalists, I feel what we try to do clearly is report the facts as we discern them and fact check them, deliver that to audience, and then add breadth and context. We try to kind of analyze things more than breathlessly report them. Also, I was nodding my head a lot when Jessie and Dan were talking about their approaches. What we like to do that as well, kind of take an issue, take a controversy, take some kind of, huge blow up, and find the people behind it, why it matters to people, what is this issue, and how is it affecting people? And sometimes we kind of go in adjacently. Last week, we interviewed Professor a poli-sci professor from UW-Eau Claire, who is the faculty advisor to a group that brings students of very different partisan persuasions and opinions together. And he calls it the Anti-Debate Club, because their point is to have a civil dialogue with one another, but not try to change each other's minds. And he spoke a lot about how these students, 18 to 22, really want that opportunity, but don't know how to find it. They're afraid to express their opinions through social media because they might be called out and shamed, and so it's just a really fascinating discussion. But that was one way that we approached the Charlie Kirk assassination, and then what happened after that. And I asked him directly, so did your students take this on? He said, oh yeah, we talked about that. So I think there are ways to approach what's happening in our world around us right now that doesn't add to what feels frightening.
Jessie, talk a little bit about how you balance the pressure to be first with a story versus the responsibility to be right, especially in a climate where if you make a mistake, that can be easily weaponized and used against you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a competition, right? Can you be first and right, or do you have to choose one or the other? And I think you just have to accept the fact as journalists that you might not be first every time, but you'd rather be right every time. Your reputation is everything. It's your currency. And, this profession, you need to be trusted. You need your sources to trust you. You need your readers to trust you. Otherwise, what's the point of you being there? They're not going to come back to you. So they're not necessarily going to remember that you broke the story every time. They're not going to remember that you were the first person to, say, oh, this person got in the governor's race, but they are going to remember if you got it totally wrong, or, spread something that, turned into a wildfire. So it's not really, in practice, it's not that difficult. You just have to accept that fact. In theory, when you're scrambling and you're trying to beat the competition, because I think every journalist just has that competitive instinct in them. And you can get caught up in the adrenaline of, something exciting that's happening, or the possibility that you are going to get the scoop and you are going to beat the competition. But it's just not as important as getting it right.
So talk a little bit about the process you go through, and then the process that for those who aren't aware of how we work, the process after you file a story.
Sure. So, I mean, it really depends on the story, but, say, I don't know, like, what kind of story do you want me to kind of go through?
I'll talk about just a run-of-the-mill story, daily story that you're filing on deadline about something that happened in the Capitol. How do you verify facts, and what happens after you file the story?
Sure. Well, we had an interesting one actually recently in the Capitol where a Democratic lawmaker kind of was on the outs with some of her colleagues in the Democratic caucus. And I did break that story, and I realized I had to break it when I started realizing other people had it too. And I was like, okay, well, we're going to have to move on this thing, because I wasn't totally sure how I felt about going forward with it. This lawmaker had come to me, talked to me about her experience, and told me some things that she, through her perspective, how this thing had played out. And I wasn't going to write that story just entirely based on her perspective. I needed to talk to, her colleagues, and I needed to ideally confirm some things with, in this case, Capitol Police and legislative leadership, because she was telling me she had been banned from the Capitol because of something that had happened with her colleagues. So with that information, I obviously wanted to be first with it, but I held on to it for a while because I was trying to make those calls and, get some confirmation. And so on a story like that, you have some conversations that are on background, because I needed to talk to some people who could tell me what was going on, but would not put their name on it. It was information that I could use. I could attribute it to, X source, in X position, but I couldn't say who it was. And I needed that. I also needed people who could talk on the record about what was happening. So, when I got to a point where I was comfortable with it, we did run with it, and we were able to just beat somebody else on it. So, I got my little win there. But it was, so you do that. You go through that process. You feel like it's solid. You've talked to everyone that you can talk to. You've gotten all the answers that you can possibly get. And there's a possibility that you're gonna have to do some follow-up stories. I probably did 3 or 4 follow-up stories on this, but I sent it to my editor. He looks through it, obviously looks for, we don't really have, multiple copy editors down the line like the days of yore. So it's pretty much like give it a read, look for any errors. And then if he has any questions, which I think on this story, he probably wanted to double check a couple of things. And then it pretty much goes. And then from there, it's, looking to see how people are responding to it, looking to see if there are follow-up angles or if this is just kind of a one and done, leave it alone. Ideally, when a story comes out, you do get some follow-up ideas. Maybe someone contacts you and says, "Hey, did you know about this?" Or, did you look into this thing? And, you can get some legs out of it. But yeah, I guess that's pretty much the process.
Yeah, and at each step of the process, you're verifying facts and information. An editor's looking over your shoulder, checking that information. And this is very unlike what we often see, just get posted by people on social media. So that's why we call it a profession. Hey, Ron, you've been involved in journalism education for a long time in various ways, and you have students now working at NNS. How do you see journalism education and media literacy more broadly fitting into any solution for mis and disinformation?
So NNS is a professional newsroom. It's not student-based, but it is, we have anytime between 5 to 7 interns a school year. And we don't treat them any differently than we do our staff. So I always have felt that NNS has been at an intersection of education and information. And what we do is we really explain to everyone, the newcomer to the first year student, here's what we do. We center our audience. Here are the standards, explaining to them what it means. So we had an intern last summer, and she wanted to do a profile of someone. And so she did a profile, but she didn't have any sources other than that person. So I'm like, we require 3 to 5 sources, and they must be people in the community. So if you're doing a story about, the mayor counts, but it doesn't count as a community source. So we want that to happen. So there's rigor in what we do and how we do it. And I think when we talk about education and media literacy, it is so important because people don't understand what we do as journalists. So it's taking that mask off and explaining to them, explaining to students. We go out to senior citizen centers. We go out to the youth centers and just talk about what we do. And at the basic level, it's really about relationships, forming a relationship with your community and your readers, but also making sure that they understand the principles of, okay, you might be an influencer, but what are you using? Do you share our values? Here are our values. Here's what happens when I always tell the staff, if you mess up, fess up. It's actually okay to make a mistake. It's not okay to keep making the same mistake. And it's certainly not okay not to acknowledge that you made a mistake. So we are very transparent. So when I came here 6 years ago, when we don't make that many mistakes, but we make them, we're human, right? So we started putting editor's notes at the top of the story. And our friends at Urban Milwaukee said, "Hey, are you guys making more mistakes now?" I'm like, "No, we're just acknowledging that we made a mistake. And I'm not putting it at the end of the story because maybe people don't get to the end of the story."
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of transparency has helped because when we have done that, even with a source that maybe was mad at the moment, the reporter called and apologized. They saw the editor's note and they were willing to talk to us because we owned it. And I think as journalists, we had to go, we can't be gatekeepers. We got to open that gate and explain the process. We're not very good at telling our story. We're not very good about telling the principles behind the stories. And we make assumptions that people know what we do, and they don't. They don't understand how government institutions work. They certainly don't understand how journalism works. that breeds a culture of distrust. And so you cannot overcome that without having connections in the community. Yeah, I was managing editor of USA Today before taking this NNS role. When you're a managing editor of USA Today, it's really the world, right? It's the and that's hard to figure out what everyone wants in the world. It's a lot easier, I think, when it's hyper local, but that does not preclude us from trying to get that done.
Dan, let me go back to you. Can you talk about what the fact-checking process is like at the New York Times Magazine, or even when you did your book?
Yeah.
Talk about the
Well,
rigor.
and also I wrote a lot for the New Yorker. My career, I began as a fact checker for the New Yorker. That's how I got into journalism. And I think it's really the best way, no offense to anyone, but I think it's better than journalism school. I didn't go to journalism school. I sort of lucked into this job, and I really learned the editing process, the reporting process by working very closely with writers. It's basically essentially re-reporting an article. We would at the New Yorker, it's very renowned for its rigor. I mean, people make mistakes there too, but there's a lot of effort and energy gone into accuracy. And there was an interesting piece a couple weeks ago in the New Yorker, a history of the fact-checking department at the magazine. I encourage you guys to read it. But it's an incredibly rigorous process. I've spent several weeks fact-checking a piece by Seymour Hersh with another checker. But sometimes a lot of stuff is more straightforward than that. And it's really what taught me, I think, the value of this kind of rigor, and because it's both checking what's in the piece and then, trying to address, the checker will actually sometimes flag, whether there's sort of a hole in the piece's arguments or so on, sort of things that are beyond just what is presented to you, the material that's presented to you. But at the New Yorker or at the Times, you get, the author turns over their sources, their notes, or transcripts, and the checker will call these people. They don't read the quotes back verbatim because that's a recipe for them trying to rewrite their quotes, but it's a kind of a paraphrasing of the factual material within the quote. So like people say things, and there's often a lot of factual details within that quoted material. So also, and those things would get checked independently. It could be something as banal as Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th. If they misspoke and that was somehow quoted, you'd have to go back to them and correct it. But it's a very complex process. It's hard to describe, but I would just in a shorthand describe it as basically re-reporting the piece, trying to work with the author, not oppositionally, but maintaining a kind of inherent skepticism around everything, which is a useful tool when you're writing your own material, like just to have that voice in there. So yeah, at the Times and at the New Yorker, for the magazine anyway, the Times, the newspaper is not, there's no independent fact checkers there. It's much more of a part of the magazine culture, independent fact checking, although it's been, I mean, fewer places do it now than used to, but I've been lucky that was my training. And I think it was a wonderful training and really important. Also teaching you how to speak on the phone to delicate sources. There's so many complicated things that have happened to me over time that were really useful later in life, when I was doing my own work. And as far as the book, I hired an independent checker because I really, former New Yorker checker, just because everybody makes mistakes. And when you're in the writing mode, it's a different, you're thinking about different things. I mean, you want it to be accurate. You're not making stuff up, but the emphasis is on, making your story as dynamic and as moving or as powerful as you're envisioning it. And, sometimes, and also you're working quickly, possibly. My book had a very short deadline. So I hired someone else, and she basically checked it as almost as rigorously as a magazine piece. It can be hard because it's a much longer amount of material, but I would help her and sort of did the best I could one thing that's very helpful is if the writer is very forthcoming with their source material, which is a requirement at those magazines, but some people are more reluctant to turn over their notes or so on and so forth. So it can be a little bit of a battle, but that's essentially how I do it. And I'm a total nut, and I'll wake up in the middle of the night and wake my wife up just worried about some fact or something that I may have gotten wrong. So anyway, it's a kind of obsession, and that I think is a casualty of so many years spent fact checking myself. But it's a useful problem to have mostly.
But even on a smaller level, I want the team to be obsessed with accuracy. So we have a new managing editor. Edgar's been a reporter. He's been here for 14 years. And we were going over some things. And I said, Edgar, is this CQ? Is this correct? And I knew it wasn't correct. The reporter had put someone was a CEO, and I knew that person was an executive director. So I said, here, if your mom says she loves you, check it out. And we do that same thing here on a day-to-day basis. And in class, I graded on the content, but also if they made a mistake and they misspelled a name, that was an F. And so I learned that way too, not to do those things, to check everything. If I'm Jessie, she may not have that luxury. She's trying to break news, but come back to it. Someone else needs to come back and do it.
I would just chime in and say, I keep nodding my head with everything that folks are saying, especially that piece where in the middle of the night, you're like, is that it? Right. I think we've all been there, but we have the luxury here at PBS Wisconsin on this particular program. It's a weekly. And so we kind of do our fact checking before, during, and after. We can work fast. I come from a commercial news background, and as do many of the people who work on our news staff here. So we can do it, but our timeline is that we work toward Friday for the broadcast, every day for our online. But again, it's not as much breaking news. It's more kind of context-based, analysis-based. What are people thinking? We cover the state, and so we like to go all the places we can get to within the confines of travel time, etc. But we do have many eyes on a product. We are all skeptics. Really, some of our news meetings are, all right, settle down. People are kind of skeptical as journalists, and we start with that premise. Like even if it's an expert where you're cross-checking facts, they may be an expert, but do they also have an additional agenda? And so there are very many different kinds of layers to making sure that things are accurate, because yes, that is the number one goal.
Before we get to audience questions, and I think we still want to go in just a couple of minutes, is that right, Sam and Lisa? I'll assume it is. Let me ask you all for a quick answer to one other question. What concerns you most, journalistically speaking, about the era that we're living in right now? And Frederica, let me start with you.
I think people would say that what is most concerning is that the act of journalism and journalistic integrity will go by the boards because of the flood of information and mis and disinformation. But we were talking about students. We work with student journalists most often from UW-Madison. They are so smart and so technically savvy, so well read, and so well educated, even as undergraduates, that I have real faith in the future. So I think I flipped your question and made it positive, but that's what I would say.
Jessie, how about you?
Well, I will agree. We also work with a lot of UW-Madison students. We get interns over the summer, and they're always fantastic. So it does give you hope, but it does, I think you have, at least I have some days where I'm like little tired, a little burnt out, a little cynical, and the interns are always a breath of fresh air when that starts to happen. Um, yeah, I think Frederica had alluded to this earlier, just the we don't really know what we're dealing with, I guess. Like we don't know how bad it is. I see AI and I see smart people falling for it. I saw like one of the professors at my journalism school sharing fake AI stories on Facebook the other day, and I was like, great, it's getting everyone, it's getting the smart people too. So that's frightening. And the other thing that frightens me, I guess, is how do you get to people? And that was your first question, I guess. I wonder who we're reaching with our stories. I wonder, is anyone reading this who doesn't already know what's going on, who doesn't already care, who isn't already invested in, preserving democracy and, participating in the process. And I just kind of have to hope that, we are doing that and that we are reaching people outside of that sphere. But yeah, to end on a positive note, again, the future is great. The students are great.
Thanks for bringing up AI. We haven't really touched on that, but that I think is certainly something I'm very concerned about. Ron, let me go to you next. What concerns you most right now about the current environment?
I don't want journalists to lose their brilliance and resilience. And it can seem like each day there's a blow here and a blow there. And I think we have to keep our North Star. And I'm not worried about it because I see people doing great things all the time. I just want people to stay encouraged and to keep doing that work. And something that Jessie said, are we being read? I think as journalists, we have to realize that there are many ways to tell our stories and to actually go where the reader wants to go where the viewer wants to go where the listener wants to go, and not where we want to go.
Great, thank you. Dan, same question.
I think the thing that concerns me most about journalism is consolidation, and really just the entire American economy, the consolidation, which is, maybe particularly noticeable in terms of media, or particularly detrimental in terms of media. But, I was thinking back on when I grew up in Madison in the 70s and 80s, there were two daily papers, and both locally owned. And it was, and that was, in my dad's growing up in New York, there were 8 daily papers. And I think it's healthier for society. And the consolidation of media is reflected in other aspects of, social media has kind of had, in my view, a fairly pernicious role in terms of journalism. And so I guess consolidation is my biggest fear. I'll also echo what Jessie and Frederica said. I have a fellowship at the University of Missouri to work on a book, and I we got together in September, earlier this month, and one of the aspects of the fellowship is working with a student, journalism student, and all of the students were just exceptional. And I was really heartened by that, because I guess I went to it not with a cynical mindset, but I I don't know. I've seen in my own personal history the shrinkage and sort of a narrowing of viewpoints that accompanies that shrinkage. And I just wondered if these values that I do care about, like accuracy and rigor, were even remembered or something. But they really were, and I was really heartened, by the students. So I think they're entering a landscape that's much worse even than when I started in the late 90s. But I am encouraged by their adherence to these sort of values. I was really moved by it, actually. So.
Great, thank you. Well, let's move to questions from our viewers. And if you want to type your question in the chat, that would be great. Otherwise, do they have the ability to raise their hand? Can we call on them?
Yes, we can call on them.
Okay, so great. Feel free to do that as well. Any questions for our panel?
I can start us off with one. And first, just want to say thanks to Dave and the panelists for being here and illuminating these complex issues. It's been really great. I wonder if you could, if anybody wants to respond to, any lessons we can learn, particularly if there are any good examples of journalism that really has done a good job in dealing with stories like the Charlie Kirk murder and the murder of Melissa Hortman and this political violence that seems to be on everyone's mind. Are there some lessons or some good examples that you've seen that really show why journalism matters and how it can play such a vital role in our democracy?
I'll take it. Since everyone got quiet. Particularly with the Minnesota slayings, I was really happy to see how the Minnesota Star Tribune, the TV stations, and then Minnesota has this great ecosystem of nonprofit newsrooms that were talking to people, really explaining what happened, and really kind of working together to get answers from authorities that we hadn't seen before. And I think what we're seeing now is journalism really is about collaboration. Even, Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service and Wisconsin Watch, which is the statewide newsroom, we started working together 5 years ago. And we made the point that we were not here to compete, but we were here to complete. So we don't try to take funders or stories, but we work together at times to better explain those type of stories. And so that's a movement that I'm seeing with the Institute for Nonprofit News, which has 450 nonprofit newsrooms. We work together to talk about issues and to get those things done. So that excites me, those kind of partnerships.
I would echo what Ron said about the Minnesota Star Tribune and all the local news outlets. It was really impressive to watch the way that first of all, this is personal for all of them. It was reporters who, you cover people in the Capitol and you really get to know them. You see them every day and you get to know how they work over the years. And so it's a personal story for them, but also they got every element of it. They were looking at the law enforcement element of it. They were looking at the political element of it. And I think most importantly, they really got into the human element of it. And so there was a lot of storytelling about who these people are and who they were. And that continued on, for weeks to come. And that was that's the other thing I would say. They didn't drop it. They continue to follow through. This wasn't like this big bad thing happened and we covered it for a few days and we moved on. They really continued and they didn't let it go.
Just a reminder, if you want to type your questions in the chat, please do so or raise your hand and we'll call on you. Any other questions from our participants or from our audience? While we're waiting, Ron, I want to turn to you. For journalists to make an impact, their business model has to work. And for that, we know what's happened to the business model for legacy media, especially TV, radio, and newspapers. What role are partnerships playing for you and for other journalism organizations?
What do you mean when you say partnerships?
Well, you recently had an alliance with Wisconsin Watch, but there are examples around the state of nonprofits working together on, stories or projects or in a particular coverage area, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a really great question. When I came here, I was really excited that NNS was in the journalism business, but it was never in the business of journalism. So every 2 years, we were shocked that we had no money, because a funder went out. And so the merger with Wisconsin Watch actually did a couple of things. It gave us a business strategy. They needed more exposure in Milwaukee. We could rely on their business team and add to that business team and share what we're doing together, a hyper local newsroom and a statewide newsroom coming together to super serve communities across Wisconsin. That was more attractive for funders. And so now we look at, in terms of partnerships, we look at events. We're looking at, not, we always work with anyone and everyone, so that's not really the main focus for me. It's thinking about like how can we collaborate to sustain what we do. There's 500 nonprofit newsrooms across the country, and they're probably being run by, you think of ProPublica and Texas Tribune, but most of these newsrooms are being run by two people, a husband and wife, one person, and they're doing everything. So we look at like, how can we, as we are moving forward, lift up others? And so particularly in Milwaukee, when I think of the ethnic press, I'm often in contact with the Milwaukee's Black press to talk about, hey, did you find out about this? It's never been an easy sell because I think we have a scarcity mindset. This is my money. We can't talk. And one weekly said to me, now, why would you do that? Aren't you competing with us? And I said, well, we're actually not competing with you. But even if we were, as one of us won, I would be happy. And so I think it's kind of changing that mindset. Partnerships matter, but also realize that it's not easy breezy. Partnership means that, what are you getting? How is it mutually beneficial? So an out-of-state, out-of-country website newsroom called us during the RNC and said, hey, we would love to follow you around and learn things and help, help your audience. And I said, well, how would that help our audience? And they seemed really shocked. They thought that because they called, we were going to be like, oh, thank you. CNN did call. And they said, how can we help? And we worked with them. And it was not transactional. But at the end of the RNC, we got a nice 60-inch screen TV that CNN was going to throw away in Chicago. So there's a reason sometimes to collaborate. And it's not always easy. But you have to think about partnerships and also what is not being covered and how does that help? We don't need to replicate. We need to just complete each other.
So we have a question from one of our listeners. How can we get this information to our high school and K through 12 students, teach them how to be accurate, teach them how to discern misinformation, and teach them how important it is to have multiple sources? I'm assuming we're talking about journalism students, but also can be true for just consumers of news too. So who'd like to take that question?
I'll take it. I think, first start with the journalists that you admire. Invite them to come in. Start with the universities that are there. There's a infrastructure that's already there, and you just need to tap into that. There are also other outside organizations like Student Press Law Center, many resources. But start with the journalists that you know and admire and see what they can do to come in and help.
Anybody else? Well, we're just a couple of minutes before the hour, so let me just wrap up with this. In the last 5 years, I worked as an opinion editor and as the person who's sort of in charge of our public forum at the News Journal Sentinel. I saw this change in how people were treating one another in the public debate. And so it is a real question, a real problem. And what I'm heartened by, and I'll echo what others have said here, is when I left the paper in 2022, I felt like we had the best young staff I'd ever seen of young journalists in that room. And I know the same is true at Neighborhood News Service, the same is true at Wisconsin Public Television, the same is true across the business. So that gives me a lot of hope. I want to thank our panelists today for being with us. Ron Smith from Neighborhood News Service, Jessie Opoien, a political reporter in the Madison Bureau with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Frederica Freiberg, the news anchor and host of Here and Now with Wisconsin Public Television, and Dan Kaufman, a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and author of the 2018 book, The Fall of Wisconsin. Thank you so much for being with us today. And be sure, if you weren't able to attend today, we'll have the video up on our website.